Hey, I want to make a few very simple training videos to save you time and effort on your new Fujifilm X-T3, and as I've been told, there are a lot of first-time Fuji users that are going to, since it's their first time, find it slightly complicated in using their Fujifilm X-T3 because they're not used to the system, even though it is very straightforward and extremely customizable. One complaint that a lot of people have is that there's an excessive number of dials. They're not used to that. They may or may not like them. But one thing that I do, since I'm usually shooting an aperture priority right now, of course, I have my shutter wheel locked in A for automatic shutter, which I always set my aperture manually. I am in obviously aperture priority right now. I never, basically never, sometimes shoot manual with flash. Usually shoot manual with flash. I never actually adjust my shutter speed dial, basically never, or my exposure compensation dial, or my ISO dial. Right now you actually see I have both my ISO dials set to A and locked in, and set to A for automatic on my shutter speed, since I always shoot aperture priority, and C, my exposure comp dial, which I never adjust. I actually adjust it by a clickable function on the front command dial that lets me switch between both my ISO with one click and an additional click. Then I'm able to change my exposure comp. And then let's also run through some really important functions on the X-T3, some stuff that you really should change away from factory default. And you'll notice, let me actually zoom in and have you look at something. Right now I'm going to click my front command dial, and you'll actually see that this will switch over to adjusting my ISO. So right now I'm just turning my front command dial to whatever ISO that I want, and I click it again, and then I go over to my exposure comp. I also have a scale over here on my left that shows that, which you can do in screen setup. You can either have this displayed or not displayed, but right now I'm adjusting my exposure comp vis-a-vis the front command dial. The only way I change it is I make one click to go back and forth between ISO and exposure comp. It's extremely handy, so I never actually have to adjust my exposure comp wheel, my shutter speed dial, or my ISO. I never adjust my ISO dial. But let's actually change some important things in the menu systems, which are default on the Fujifilm X-T2 and X-T3 that should not be. And then in the second video, what we're going to do is take a look at some other functions, like setting up our function buttons. But let's zoom out here. There we go. Now let's go over to ISO mode. Right now you can see I'm image size largest possible, raw plus fine, and also shooting redundancy. In other words, I'm shooting mirror, same thing to card slot 1 as I am to card slot number 2. For raw recording, I'm shooting lossless compressed, since there's no advantage in uncompressed. Let's go change some things. I always have a long exposure noise reduction set to off. You may or may not like that, but the important thing that I want to show you is, let's see, AFSC mode, continuous. Follow along with me. Autofocus illuminator, you can turn that off or on. Like, the only reason you want to turn it off is like an indoor event. The autofocus illuminator is, blinding someone in the eye, or a low light club scene. Face eye detect, AF plus MF. I have that, I think, yeah, factory default is set to off. I always turn that on. What that lets you do in a single autofocus mode is, once you've actually focused the camera after half press, you can actually override the focus, and then focus peaking will kick in by turning the dial on your lens for fine-tune fine-tune focusing manually by overriding where the camera is chosen for autofocus. And let's show you something that's actually extremely important. IS mode. This is image stabilization mode. We can actually switch between continuous and shooting only, which continuous is mode 1, where it's always on. Shooting only is mode 2. You should only be using shooting only where the actual image stabilization on the lens kicks in at the last fraction of a second before the shot is taken. Continuous should not be used for fast shooting. Continuous is for much slower shutter speeds, so remember to keep that in mind. Let's go to something else that should be turned off because it is absolutely useless. It is an ultrasonic vibration panel, which is set onto the sensor of your camera, called sensor cleaning. I always have that off Default is that it's switched on when you turn the camera off. Just turn it off for both. It wastes time and it absolutely gives you no advantage. It does, in no way, shape, or form, other than rarely shake off a piece of dust into the bottom of your camera. There's no advantage to ever having a sensor cleaning on. Let's go over to screen setup and preview exposure balance. And here we go. Like if you're going to use a speed light or a strobe, obviously, you want to be all manual, like if you're using a strobe. So you have your camera, it's kind of dark, and you're going to be using a speed light or a studio strobe. The default is set to on, so your screen's going to look black. Either your LCD or your EVF are going to look black because the camera thinks you're taking a shot that's way, way too dark. It has no idea, you know, the power output that's going to come from your speed light or your strobe. So in manual mode, this should be set default off, but it's not. This is the first thing you should actually turn off, and default is on, but you should turn it off. There's really no reason to have that on, really none, because if you're shooting all manual, you know what to do as far as setting up your studio strobe and outputting the light that you want. ISO dial, we're going to go to buttons and dial settings, and going to go to A and change that to command, which will let you use the front command dial for switching back and forth between ISO and exposure comp and adjustment via the front command dial, so you no longer have to actually adjust ever your exposure comp dial or your ISO dial. Okay, and shoot without lens on. This is one everybody gets wrong because when you use an adapted lens, the default is off. But you need to turn that on. So if you want to stick an adapted lens on your camera and use it, the camera will not let you take a picture with the default, which is set to off. So turn shoot without lens on to on, which basically means you're going to use an adapted lens with a dumb adapter, basically. Here's something else that's incredibly, incredibly important. Shutter AE, which is on page 2 of button dial settings. This is wrong, and it is actually set to default on the camera, but this should be set to off. What this means is that when you're doing a burst shot, especially with a moving subject, it means that the exposure is locked once you take the first shot, and that should not be there's almost no instance where you want that to occur. You want this set to off so that when you're panning with the shot and the lighting changes, that means as you're ripping them off really fast, that the camera is every fraction of a second changing the exposure to match the subject that you're panning your camera with and taking a shot with. So this is set incorrectly, default to on. You should set it to off so that it will instantly change exposures as you're panning and shooting a continuous shooting mode. Okay, let's go to touch screen settings, which I believe is on page 3. Here we go. This is also incredibly important. You can choose to turn it off or on. I use it for autofocus point selection using my thumb with my face pressed up against the camera. Here's something really important. Since your camera doesn't know the difference between your nose and your finger or your thumb, then what you want to do is you do not want the entire, which is what it is set to default, where the entire screen is active for touch. Now with your face pressed up against the camera, whether your right eye or left eye, your nose is going to be touching somewhere on the screen. That's all well and fine, but that means that your point selection, your camera doesn't know the difference between your thumb and your nose, okay? So since my nose is always over here and I'm using the thumb on my left hand to adjust the autofocus only in this small quadrant of the LCD display, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the active area, which is highlighted in blue, to the section, the only section that I want, which is the bottom left section of the LCD. Yours may be over here, wherever you want it, but you don't want it here, which is the entire screen, which is default. You don't want that. You want some sort of personalized area that fits you. So that's where it fits me correctly. Here's something that's really neat that's on the X-T3. Screen setting contrast adjustment, which is screen setting. Okay, and it's on page 3. This is neat. We're at standard right now. If you're shooting like in a low light club scene or time exposure, somewhere dark, and you don't want this bright screen, blinding you, you could change it to this, and boom, look at that. Perfect for low light, nighttime shooting, astrophotography, dark club scene shooting, so on and so forth. So that's perfect. Just remember where to change it to when you go to change it back. So thank you so much for watching. Check out the next training videos. I'm going to move that back to standard now. Next training videos on the X-T3 Fujifilm, and let me know if you have any questions, okay? If you like these videos, you can click the link below and let me know what I can help you with. Thank you.